All right, let's talk about one of the strangest, most mysterious roles within the Imperium of Man. Something that sounds more like legend than structured institution. The Eyes of the Golden Throne. The name alone sparks the imagination. It conjures images of hooded figures in shadowed vaults, gazing through golden lenses at timelines that haven't happened yet. Whispers of psychers tethered to machines older than entire worlds, interpreting dreams the Emperor might never have dreamed. These aren't your average data analysts or battlefield scouts. This is something deeper, more arcane, soaked in prophecy, paranoia, and the perpetual desperation of a dying empire clinging to any edge it can find. In the darkest corners of the Imperium, knowledge is hoarded like treasure, and nowhere is that truer than in the domains surrounding the Golden Throne. Not just in the halls of Terra or the bastions of the Adeptus Custodes, but in those quiet, unmarked sanctuaries filled with vox static and the scent of burning incense. The Eyes of the Golden Throne, as the term has come to be known among fans and scholars alike, don't have an official listing in any Imperial tome. You won't find them named in the Codex Astartes or even whispered of in a Black Library novel, at least not directly. But they exist, or at least, they might. That's what makes this so compelling. There's a deep fascination in the fandom with the idea that the Emperor, dead yet living, bound to his throne in a state beyond understanding, might not be entirely blind. That through his servants, those deeply psychically attuned to him, he can still see. And not just see the present, but gaze across time itself. Past, present, and future collapsing into one fractured kaleidoscope of burning light and screaming echoes. A kind of divine surveillance, but one that transcends surveillance and moves into something far more dangerous: foresight. This theory, this idea of the Emperor having eyes who act as oracles, spies, and interpreters of time, has been brewing in the fan community for years. It's partly based on scraps of lore, partly on implication, and partly, let's be honest, on the desperate hope that the Imperium isn't completely flying blind into an eternal war zone. Because how else do you explain the unexplainable? The sudden appearances of Astartes in just the right place, the calculated timing of inquisitorial strikes, the eerie predictions found in some ecclesiarchy sermons. Either it's all random luck on a galactic scale, or someone, or something, is watching from behind the curtain. But that raises the chilling question. If there truly are eyes watching through the veil of time, what do they see? And more terrifyingly, how does one remain sane while seeing it? For me personally, that's where the obsession starts. Not just in the concept of psychic observation or warp-induced visions, but in the possibility that these servants, these eyes, are prisoners of their own perception. Imagine being chained to a vision of the galaxy that never stands still, where you are cursed to observe 1,000 possible dooms, 1,000,000 failed futures, and still be expected to advise the most brutal regime in existence on what comes next. So today, we're diving deep, not just into what the Eyes of the Golden Throne might be, but into how they could function, who they might be, and, most importantly, whether they truly spy across time itself. There's no official chapter on this in any codex, no neat and tidy timeline. But in the patchwork mythos of Warhammer 40k, sometimes the truth hides best in the shadows between facts. And if you're like me, drawn to the esoteric, the forbidden, the slightly unhinged corners of lore, then you're in for something special. Let's begin. To really understand what it means to be one of the Eyes of the Golden Throne, we need to talk about the foundation, the very backbone of Imperial psychic communication, the Astropaths. If the Golden Throne has eyes, then the Astropaths are the retina, the nerve cluster, the raw biological channel through which information and intention flow across the stars, and not just any information. We're talking about desperate pleas from dying worlds, inquisitorial secrets, military maneuvers, and sometimes, just sometimes, visions that feel like they've been whispered straight from the Emperor himself. Astropaths are psychers, of course, but they're something far more than the average psychic conscript you'd see shivering in a Scola Progenium dormitory or strapped to an inquisitorial interrogation slab. These are individuals who have undergone the terrifying, irreversible process known as soulbinding. It's a rite that literally forges their soul to the Emperor's will in the heart of the Imperial palace. The survivors, because many don't make it, are irrevocably changed. Blind in the physical sense, yes, but their inner sight becomes terrifyingly sharp. They don't just sense the warp, they live in it, breathe it, and that's what makes them invaluable to the Imperium. Through this bond, they can send psychic messages across incomprehensible distances, hurling desperate cries and bureaucratic commands alike across the warp, often at the cost of their own sanity. And make no mistake, this isn't like writing an email. Every time an astropath reaches into the warp to cast a thought, they risk being torn apart by demons, overwhelmed by visions, or simply lost in the madness between worlds. It's like shouting across a hurricane and hoping your friend hears you on the other side, only your voice might attract things that shouldn't be listening. But here's where it gets really interesting for us, the ones who can't stop poking into the cracks of lore. The Imperium doesn't just use astropaths as interstellar postmen. They're watchers, interpreters, and sometimes they're weapons. The network they form, this vast lattice of minds and signals known as the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, is not just for communication. It's a surveillance web, a sensor array for more than just troop movements and administrative updates. In some segments of the fandom, there's a belief that certain clusters of astropaths act as early warning systems for psychic threats, that they're trained to detect ripples in the warp, anomalies that hint at demonic incursions, rising heresies, or even glimpses of divergent timelines. Some fans even speculate that high-level astropathic choirs, those groups of bound psychers that sing messages through the void in harmony, might be capable of more than just messaging. That in rare, extreme cases, their combined psychic power, all filtered through the Emperor's presence, could generate brief moments of clarity, as if the galaxy's future briefly aligns in front of them, like constellations suddenly arranging themselves into words. These aren't canon-confirmed moments, but the lore leaves enough gaps that these ideas feel frighteningly possible. I've read old forum posts, archived threads from fanatics who've dug into every Black Library mention of astropaths, and one theory keeps cropping up, that some astropaths aren't just receivers or senders, but decoders of prophecy. They receive images, not words, impressions, a sense of dread from a system they've never been to, a vision of a burning sky they can't explain, and sometimes those images match events that haven't happened yet. Of course, the ecclesiarchy dismisses this as metaphor or the madness of overstressed psychers. But if we're being honest with ourselves, when has madness not been a message in the Imperium? And here's the thing I can't stop thinking about. These astropaths are all linked, however loosely, through their connection to the Emperor. Every single one underwent soulbinding, which means that in some way, no matter how distant, a part of him touches a part of them. Is it so impossible then to believe that he might see through them? That their dreams, their moments of terror or inspiration aren't entirely their own? That perhaps in moments of dire need, the Emperor doesn't just hear, but watches? I think that's why fans are so obsessed with the idea of the eyes of the Golden Throne being real. Not as some uniform agency with ranks and robes, but as a scattered network of tormented visionaries, most of them not even knowing they've been chosen. Some might simply believe they've gone mad. Others might have whispered the truth to a confessor, only to be silenced forever. But among them, hidden in the static and the shadows, are the ones who see too much, and that's the price. Being an astropath isn't just about surviving the warp or delivering vital information. It's about bearing witness, sometimes to events that haven't happened yet, sometimes to horrors that should never be spoken aloud. They are more than servants. In the quietest moments, I wonder if they are his dreams given form, or perhaps his memories of futures that might have been. Let's get into something that's always felt more spiritual than scientific, the soul link between psychers and the Emperor. It's one of those things that's not often spelled out in the lore with exact definitions or technical schematics, but it's everywhere when you start looking. The connection that binds soul-bound astropaths to the Emperor isn't just a ritualistic mark. It's something far deeper, metaphysical, and honestly kind of terrifying. We're not talking about a radio channel here. It's more like being tethered to the dying heartbeat of a god. When an astropath undergoes the soul-binding, it's not just about survival or psychic amplification. It's a moment of absolute exposure. Their entire being, mind, soul, everything they are, is pressed against the vast, unknowable essence of the Emperor. And during that single, searing moment, something passes between them. No one can really describe it, not even those who survive. But nearly every account speaks of visions, fragments of memories that aren't theirs, the sensation of falling through galaxies, or the overwhelming feeling of being seen by something far, far beyond human understanding. Some fans believe that during the binding, the Emperor imprints a shard of himself into the psyker. Not a consciousness exactly, but an echo, a sliver of divine awareness that remains buried within the soul of the astropath like an ember, flickering silently until some unknown moment when it flares to life. And that's where the theories really take off. Because if that ember can ignite, if it can bloom into full awareness even for a second, then maybe, just maybe, the Emperor can watch through it. There's something poetic and horrifying about that idea. That in the darkest hours of the Imperium, some poor, broken astropath might suddenly find themselves possessed not by demons, not by madness, but by something even more overwhelming, the pure, burning will of the master of mankind. And through their eyes, he sees. Through their pain, he understands. Through their death, perhaps he acts. You start to see this pattern when digging into obscure lore. The way astropaths or high-level psychers sometimes speak as if guided by something beyond themselves. The way their prophecies don't feel like predictions, but memories. The dreams they describe after the soul binding are often of terror, not as it is now, but as it might have been. Grand towers, golden cities, weeping skies, memories of the past, visions of a future that never was? Or are they the dreams of the Emperor bleeding into mortal minds? Some fans go further. There are entire threads online about the theory that the Emperor never stopped seeing through his chosen, that while his body is entombed and ravaged, his consciousness flickers from mind to mind like a signal searching for a stable connection. He doesn't just observe, he feels. That through the agony and faith of his servants, he can remember what it is to be human. That he can still shape the galaxy, not through armies, but through moments, through whispers in dreams, through the sudden clarity of a seer, through the trembling hand of a scribe who writes a message he doesn't understand. It's even said that some inquisitors are aware of this, that the Ordo Hereticus, or perhaps even the Ordo Kronos, have records of individuals who spoke words no one had taught them in languages lost to time. That these rare psychers were chosen, not in the way saints are canonized, but in the way tools are selected. Used, discarded, and every one of them described the same feeling, being watched from within. That's the part that really gets under my skin. The idea that the Emperor's gaze might not be from above, or through some technological interface, but from within the soul, that he doesn't need cameras, satellites, or even scouts. He has billions of eyes, every psyker touched by the warp, every astropath who ever screamed into the void, every tortured soul who prays in silence, hoping for a sign. They are all his mirrors, his sensors, maybe even his conscience. And then there are the dreams. I keep coming back to that, because so many accounts from psychers, saints, and even primarchs include these strange, vivid dreams. Places they've never been, voices they've never heard, images of the throne or of a golden light just beyond reach. Are these merely side effects of warp sensitivity? Or are they echoes of the Emperor's own dreaming mind, bleeding outward like ripples in a pond? There's a melancholic beauty in that the last true god of humanity might not be a commander anymore, but a dreamer, that his influence comes not through direct command, but through the chaotic, intimate medium of thought, dream, and soul. And if that's true, then the eyes of the Golden Throne aren't assigned. They're awakened, one by one, in silent moments when something ancient and immense brushes against a mortal mind and looks. When people think of the Imperium, they usually imagine towering cathedrals, endless bureaucracy, and faith-driven brutality. What doesn't always come to mind right away is just how obsessed the Imperium is with trying to predict the future. And I get it. On the surface, Warhammer 40K doesn't feel like a setting built around foresight. Everything is crumbling, chaotic, reactionary. But dig a little deeper, and you'll start to notice something strange. The Imperium does try to see ahead. Not always clearly, not always effectively, but it tries. And not just with one method either. There are entire systems, organizations, and institutions built for the express purpose of looking beyond the now. One of the most fascinating examples is the existence of sanctioned divination among Imperial psychers. Most of them are tightly leashed, of course, whether they serve the Astra Militarum or some remote ecclesiarchy world. But there are a few whose entire duty is the art of prediction. These aren't your garden variety battle psychers or mind scanners. These are individuals trained, or at least tolerated, specifically for their ability to glimpse what might come next. And while their visions are vague, symbolic, and often maddeningly contradictory, the High Lords of Terra don't ignore them. Not when a single vision might mean the difference between salvation and extinction. A particularly strange and often overlooked institution is the so-called colleges of prognostication. These rare bodies, mentioned in a few obscure sources and fleshed out more in fan theories than official documents, are said to exist across certain segmentum capitals. They're made up of psychers, scribes, and warp interpreters who work in tandem to analyze warp fluctuations, astropathic noise, and data from across the Imperium. Their purpose? To detect patterns, to find that one thread of warp static that doesn't quite fit. Maybe it's the echo of a demon incursion that hasn't happened yet. Maybe it's a psychic scream from a doomed planet 1,000 years in the future. Their work is abstract, convoluted, and often dismissed by more pragmatic arms of the Imperium. But when their predictions hit the mark, they really hit. One of the wildest things I've come across is the idea of primordial towers, or as some fans like to call them, the watchtowers of time. These are ancient psychic constructs, allegedly remnants from the dark age of technology, or even older. They're hidden, of course, shrouded behind forbidden planetary designations, quarantined by the Inquisition, or even lost within warp storms. The theory goes that these towers aren't just buildings, they're psychic amplifiers. Monuments designed to focus the minds of multiple psychers into a singular predictive force. And when they operate in unison, it's said they can look through the mist of time and catch flickers of what's coming. Of course, this is where canon and speculation blur. But I love that about Warhammer, because the absence of confirmation doesn't mean absence of truth. It just means the truth is dangerous. And that's so on brand for the Imperium. If these towers do exist, and if they're still functioning, it's likely they're being used by the most secretive branches of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, or perhaps even the Ordo Kronos. Not to predict invasions or election outcomes, but to anticipate warp breaches, black crusades, and the subtle movements of chaos gods. Then there's the way prophecy seeps into the ecclesiarchy. Now, this part is fascinating to me, not just because of the religious fanfare, but because of how blurred the line is between divine revelation and actual warp sensitivity. Imperial saints, for instance, often receive visions. Are these true predictions, or are they simply warp echoes distorted by faith? It's hard to say, but what's important is that the Imperium treats them as truth. Entire crusades have been launched because a saint saw a burning world in her dreams. Entire sectors have been sacrificed based on the mutterings of a dying pilgrim. And you know what really seals the deal for me? The fact that the Imperium actually maintains pattern analysis systems. That's right. On top of all the religious madness and psychic instability, there are still cogitators, scribes, and even servitor-run algorithms analyzing the past for signs of the future. In the heart of Terra and other segmentum capitals, entire archives are dedicated to historical extrapolation. The idea is that if you understand every major catastrophe in Imperial history, you might spot the next one before it happens. It's statistical divination, stripped of the psychic mysticism, but no less obsessive. What this all tells me is that the Imperium, for all its gothic despair and backward ways, desperately wants to see ahead. It doesn't matter whether the method is sanctioned psychers, ancient towers, divine prophecy, or raw data crunching. The goal is always the same, to outpace the next doom. Because in this universe, it's not about winning. It's about delaying extinction just a little bit longer. So when we talk about the eyes of the Golden Throne, and whether they might spy across time, this is the groundwork. The Imperium has tools for this, scattered, secretive, unreliable, but they exist. And that alone makes the possibility terrifyingly real. Not because they're perfect, but because they're desperate. And desperate people sometimes see the truth, even when they wish they hadn't. Now this is where the whole topic really starts to drift into the strange and unsettling. The moment we stop talking about sanctioned psychers or ecclesiarchal visions and step into the shadows where the real secrets are kept. Because yes, the Imperium has its public faces of foresight, choirs of Astropaths, predictive tech priests, preachers claiming divine dreams, but hidden beneath all of that are the groups we're not supposed to know about. Organizations whose very purpose is to study time itself. And the most infamous, of course, is the Ordo Kronos. Ah, the Ordo Kronos. Just saying the name makes veteran fans' ears perk up. It's one of those things in the lore that's barely mentioned, and yet its implications ripple across everything. Officially, they're a sub-faction of the Inquisition, supposedly tasked with dealing with temporal anomalies, time travel, causality disruptions, and paradoxes that threaten the Imperium's already unstable reality. But let's be honest, we know almost nothing about their inner workings. That's not an accident. That's by design. What little we do know comes from scattered references, half-remembered lines in ancient White Dwarf issues, a few Black Library mentions, and a handful of fan-sourced synopses of now out-of-print lore. But piecing those fragments together, you get a chilling picture. The Ordo Kronos doesn't operate like the Ordo Malleus or Ordo Hereticus. They don't show up with stormtroopers and flamers. They move like ghosts. Their agents are said to be chrononauts, individuals who have passed through time rifts, survived encounters with time-locked realities, or been genetically attuned to the flow of causality itself. Some fans even claim that members of the Ordo Kronos are cut off from conventional reality, that to walk their path is to be erased from the memory of the materium itself, operating in places where cause and effect don't behave the way we expect, that they don't just study time, they manipulate it. And that's what makes them so terrifying, because if they exist, they're likely the only ones in the Imperium capable of understanding what happens when the Golden Throne twitches. Out of sync. One of the most persistent theories is that the Ordo Kronos acts as a temporal watchdog for the Emperor, that they are tasked not with killing heretics or stopping demons, but with monitoring time itself for divergences, moments where history splinters or where some warp-born entity attempts to rewrite events. Think about how often timelines in 40K are blurry. Things happen that shouldn't. Entire crusades are remembered differently in different sources. Theories about time loops, lost years, or even parallel campaigns. Some of that might just be messy lore design. But what if it's deliberate? What if the Ordo Kronos is quietly scrubbing the timeline, cleaning up paradoxes the rest of us aren't even aware of? There are whispers, unconfirmed obviously, but persistent, that the Ordo Kronos operates out of sealed vaults on Mars, near the no-go zones of the Dark Mechanicum's ancient ruins, that they have access to pre-Imperial chronometric devices, tools that let them map warp time intersections and predict when a reality fracture might occur. Some fans believe they use cloned psychers trained to dream synchronously, creating shared visions that offer glimpses of possible futures. Others go even further, suggesting that the Ordo Kronos itself no longer exists in the present, but is only accessible from future points in the timeline when the Imperium has evolved into something stranger, colder, and more machine than man. But they're not the only ones. There are supposedly other factions, long forgotten or buried by the Inquisition, who dabbled in temporal prophecy. Rogue branches of the Adeptus Mechanicus obsessed with chrono calculations. Breakaway ecclesiarchal cults who claim to channel the Emperor's will through visions of what will be, not what is. Even certain navigator houses are rumored to have had libraries filled with future charts, stellar maps of systems that had not yet formed or were expected to vanish. It's all incredibly speculative, but that's what makes it so fun and so unnerving. Because the question becomes, why would the Imperium keep this all so secret? If time-based foresight is such a powerful tool, why bury it? I think the answer is simple. Because the Imperium doesn't trust time. It doesn't understand it. It fears it. The warp already warps causality, mutates perception, and disrupts continuity. To actively seek out control over time, or even understanding of it, is seen as deeply dangerous, maybe even heretical. The Inquisition burns people for dreaming about alternate timelines. Imagine what they'd do to someone who could prove they existed. And yet, the idea persists. That somewhere, in a sealed vault on Terra or a forgotten asteroid spinning on the edge of a warp storm, there are men and women, no longer truly human, watching time like others watch a data feed, waiting for anomalies, recording them, correcting them, and maybe, just maybe, whispering what they've seen into the minds of psychers on distant worlds, planting dreams, shaping fates, acting as the true eyes of the Golden Throne, not just looking across the galaxy, but across possibility itself. There's this thing I've always found mind-bending about the Warhammer 40K universe. The fact that every ship traveling through the stars is essentially diving into a sea of madness. The warp isn't just another dimension. It's emotion, thought, chaos, and pure unreality swirling together into something that defies logic. And somehow, humanity not only uses it for travel, but relies on it completely. Every astropathic message, every military deployment, every colonization effort, they all pass through the warp. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. Some fans argue that navigating the warp isn't just about spatial movement. It's about seeing through time itself. Let's start with the navigators, those gene-crafted mutant descendants of humanity whose third eyes can pierce the tides of the warp. On paper, they're just supposed to guide ships, chart a course using the light of the Astronomicon, this psychic beacon projected by the Emperor, and make sure no one flies straight into a warp rift. But ask anyone who's really looked into their lore, and they'll tell you that what navigators experience during warp travel is something way more complex than just coordinates. It's dreams, hallucinations, visions, and some of those visions feel prophetic. There's a theory I've heard thrown around fan forums more than once, that navigators don't just see where a ship is going, they see when it's going. That by staring too long into the warp's infinite depths, they sometimes slip, mentally, into fragments of futures that haven't happened yet. It makes sense in a twisted way. The warp doesn't obey our timeline. It folds and bends events, loops them, distorts them. A soul adrift in the warp might experience the future first and the past second. So what if navigators, tuned as they are to this non-linear madness, occasionally glimpse what's to come? Not metaphorically, but literally. There's even a story, possibly apocryphal, of a navigator who refused to guide a ship into a seemingly safe corridor of the warp. He claimed that, in his vision, the ship had already been destroyed, ripped apart by a warp entity that hadn't arrived yet. The crew thought he was mad. They forced the jump. And just as he predicted, the vessel was lost, vanishing from all Imperial records. Now sure, this could be coincidence. But in a universe ruled by fate and fury, maybe it was something more. Maybe his warp sight had pierced the veil between what is and what will be. This brings us to the broader idea of warp vision. It's not limited to navigators. Psychers, too, especially those trained to read the warp rather than weaponize it, sometimes describe moments where reality shifts. They'll be meditating or communing with the Astronomicon and suddenly feel a rush of images, like dreams forced into their skulls. Places they've never been, events that haven't happened. Sometimes they're warnings. Other times they're cryptic flashes of devastation or salvation. Are these simply echoes of thoughts in the warp? Or are they glimpses of actual futures waiting to collapse into the present? It gets even more complicated when you consider how the warp interacts with time. There are countless examples in the lore of ships arriving before they left, of messages being received prior to being sent, of entire fleets getting lost in the warp only to reappear centuries later, unchanged and unaware. Time doesn't flow in the warp. It boils, it churns, and anything caught in its currents is subject to its own impossible logic. So the idea that one could see through time while navigating it isn't just possible, it's almost expected. Some Mechanicus scholars, those on the fringe of what's allowed, have even proposed that warp travel is itself a kind of unconscious time scrying, that the process of calculating a warp route involves not only plotting a path through space, but aligning with a possible future where that journey succeeds. Meaning, every time a navigator opens their third eye, they're skimming the potential future of that journey, not through logic or math, but through raw psychic intuition. They're not steering toward a destination, they're steering into a timeline. And if that's true, then the warp becomes more than just a highway. It becomes an oracle. A twisted, dangerous, screaming oracle, sure, but one that reveals pieces of what could be. And the eyes of the Golden Throne? Maybe they aren't just the Astropaths or the Inquisition agents or even the Ordo Kronos watchers. Maybe some of them are navigators, individuals who have stared too long into the flux and seen more than star lanes and warp storms. Maybe they saw the Imperium fall, or ascend, or something in between. This is why I get chills when I think about the warp, not just because it's dangerous, but because it knows things we don't. It feels things before they happen. And for a few rare, unfortunate souls tasked with staring into it day after day, year after year, maybe it starts whispering, showing them pieces of something they were never meant to see. Not because the Emperor commanded it, or because the Imperium trained them, but because the warp itself wanted to be seen. So yeah, maybe warp navigation is a form of time vision, not controlled, not reliable, but real. And if that's the case, then every ship that launches into the immaterium carries with it not just the hopes of a journey, but the terrifying possibility of seeing too far ahead and never being able to unsee it. The thing about time in the Warhammer 40K universe is that it's not just weird, it's broken, bent, shattered in places like a mirror hit too many times with a hammer. It doesn't flow the way we think it should, especially when the warp gets involved. But what makes it all so much more fascinating and honestly unsettling is the number of documented and rumored cases where Imperial servants have witnessed time behave like something alive, where they've seen glimpses of the past or fragments of the future with terrifying clarity, not as prophecy, but as experience. And sometimes they didn't even know it was happening until it was far too late. There's one story that stuck with me for years, because it was one of the first times I realized how deeply time is messed with in the lore. It's the tale of the ghosts of Kallax. Officially, it's a minor anomaly. A patrol squad stationed on a backwater planet, Kallax Prime, goes missing during a warp storm. A few decades later, they return, marching in perfect formation, armor pristine, utterly unaware that they've been gone for more than a few hours. But the thing is, their return coincided with a major chaos uprising on the planet, as if the Imperium had sent reinforcements ahead of time without ever meaning to. Some believe it was a glitch in time. Others, they think something or someone used them, positioned them exactly where they were needed, when they were needed. A tactical move, made by an unseen hand across the timeline. Then there's the phenomenon known as the echoing vaults of Mnest, a hidden Mechanicus research facility where time is said to loop endlessly. Tech priests enter and exit the vault with knowledge they haven't acquired yet. Blueprints of weapons no one has invented, battle strategies for wars that haven't happened. And perhaps the most chilling part? No one knows who built the vaults. Some say it was the Emperor during the Unification Wars. Others whisper it's older than the Imperium itself. Whatever the truth, the vaults don't just record time, they fracture it. And those who spend too long inside often return, different. They speak in broken sentences, referencing events centuries out of place. One even described the fall of Mars to the Dark Mechanicum years before the Horus heresy began. Not a prophecy, just a memory misplaced. And that's the pattern, right? These aren't just visions, they're memories, but of futures that haven't happened. That's what makes time anomalies in Warhammer so unnerving. They're not poetic or spiritual like ecclesiarchal prophecies. They're clinical, unexplained. The galaxy showing you something, then pretending it didn't happen. Another fan-favorite theory involves the so-called time-broken crusade. It's said that during the 13th Black Crusade, an entire Imperial fleet disappeared in the maelstrom. No wreckage, no signals, just gone. But then reports started filtering in years later from planets across Segmentum Obscurus. Sightings of that fleet, sometimes decades apart, always appearing at the tipping point of some major conflict. They arrive, fight, and vanish again. And here's the kicker. Every surviving witness describes the same commander. Pale skin, golden eyes, wears the sigil of the Aquila upside down. Theories? Everything from a time-locked fleet bouncing between realities to a secret Ordo Kronos experiment gone wrong, to the Emperor himself guiding a ghost fleet through cracks in causality. Is any of it canon? Probably not. But it's exactly the kind of myth that feels real in a universe where reality itself can't be trusted. Some point to certain saints as proof of Imperial servants seeing through time. Take Saint Moriana, for example. Her visions were so vivid, so specific, that the Inquisition preserved her writings under stasis for millennia. She described the coming of a warrior in golden flames, of the breaking of the Black Library, of a war in which the stars themselves weep blood. To the ecclesiarchy, she was divinely inspired. But psychers who've studied her texts claim her visions align too well with warp events observed thousands of years later. Could she have seen through time, or was something feeding her those images? And if so, why? Time is also strange when it comes to warp echoes. Sometimes psychers or navigators report hearing voices in the warp, messages not yet spoken, commands from officers who haven't died yet. Some ships have recorded autologs marked with future dates. One even received an astropathic transmission from its own captain, despite that same captain being alive and on board, with no memory of ever sending the message. These aren't just inconsistencies, they're artifacts, evidence that time in the Imperium is a stitched-together patchwork, and some of those stitches are unraveling. And then there's Cadia, not just its fall, but what preceded it. There were whispers, long before Abaddon ever brought the planet low, that certain seers had foreseen its doom, not as metaphor, but as a literal collapse, torn into the eye of terror like it was always meant to be. Some Inquisitors acted on those warnings, some didn't, but it leaves you wondering, if time wanted Cadia to fall, could it have been stopped? Or was the timeline already locked? I think what makes all of this so compelling, so addictive to dig through, is that none of it is clean. There's no elegant pattern to it. These anomalies aren't part of some grand plan or secret timeline managed by a benevolent power. They're messy, frightening, raw, like the galaxy itself is trying to tell you something, but doesn't know how. And if the eyes of the Golden Throne are real, if they're scattered across the Imperium in silence, watching the timeline fracture and bleed, then maybe they don't spy across time like tacticians. Maybe they're trying to hold it together, one broken moment at a time. One of the most unsettling things about Psychers in the Warhammer universe isn't their raw power or even their link to the warp. It's their dreams. Because in a galaxy where reality and unreality bleed into one another, dreams are often more than just stray thoughts or suppressed fears. Sometimes they're warnings, sometimes they're instructions, and in rare, terrifying moments, they are echoes of a future that hasn't happened yet. A form of espionage not through data or surveillance, but through the mind, through visions, through sleep. There are countless records of sanctioned Psychers waking from nightmares they didn't understand, only for those same horrors to unfold in reality days, months, or even years later. I remember reading about a low-level Psyker assigned to a logistics team on Hydrafer. Nothing special, just another name in the tide of humanity's psychic workforce. But he kept reporting the same dream, a bridge collapsing into fire, waves of screaming civilians, and a massive black sigil burning in the sky. His superiors dismissed it as fatigue. 2 weeks later, a heretical cult detonated the main transit spire, collapsing it exactly as the Psyker described. Coincidence? Maybe. But it happens too often in the lore to ignore. And then there's the infamous case of the Vision Choir of Gethsemane, a psychic choir composed entirely of soul-bound astropaths, tasked with maintaining astropathic communication across a war-torn sector. For over 2 decades, they operated in perfect harmony. But one day, without warning, they all began painting the same image, over and over. A golden throne split down the middle, and shadows rising from beneath it. They couldn't speak, couldn't eat, just painted, wrote, and screamed variations of the same vision. Within months, that entire subsector fell into rebellion, orchestrated by a rogue cardinal claiming to be the Emperor reborn. The timing was too precise, the images too specific. It's hard not to see that as something more than madness. It felt like the warp itself was delivering a premonition, and the choir was the unwilling messenger. Prophecy in the Imperium walks a strange line between miracle and heresy. The ecclesiarchy might claim ownership over divine visions, but they're quick to burn anyone who speaks of futures that don't align with sanctioned doctrine. So, in many cases, these psychic echoes are buried, sanitized. You'll find Imperial records where references to prophecy are crossed out and rewritten as strategic foresight or battlefield instinct. But dig deep enough and you'll find the truth. Psychers see things they shouldn't. The Ordo Hereticus, has entire vaults filled with confiscated dreams. I'm not exaggerating. Some Inquisitors, those rare ones who specialize in psychic phenomena, have agents whose job is literally to listen to the dreams of sanctioned Psychers and record them. Every image, every phrase. Because sometimes, those dreams line up. A seer on Ophelia 7 reports a burning tide. 2 months later, another Psyker on a distant Forge world dreams of a dying sun. Alone, meaningless. Together? They mark the emergence of a tyrannid tendril. And that's what fans have latched onto. The idea that these dreams aren't random. That the warp, for all its chaos, tries to communicate through certain Psychers. Like scattered pieces of a puzzle only the Emperor himself might fully understand. And let's not forget the Primarchs. Magnus the Red, especially, was plagued by visions. Even before the heresy, he spoke often of dreams that didn't belong to him, futures he wished to prevent, horrors he tried to warn his father about. Of course, we all know how that ended. But it makes you wonder, if Magnus, a being created to be the pinnacle of psychic mastery, was haunted by future echoes, what chance does a regular astropath have to resist them? Even more compelling are the so-called waking dreams. These are moments where a Psyker isn't asleep or in trance, but fully conscious, and yet the world around them shifts. A vision overlays reality. The floor becomes glass. The stars move in impossible ways. Voices whisper numbers or names. Some see this as a breakdown. Others believe it's the warp pressing too closely against the skin of reality. But the most convincing theory I've come across is that these visions are not hallucinations, they are fractures. Temporary windows into alternate timelines or realities bleeding in from what might be. There's also talk among some navigators, especially those of the more eccentric houses, that during deep warp travel, they've experienced entire lives that never happened. Memories of children they never had, wars they never fought, worlds that don't exist on any map. And when they wake, these fragments stick with them like half-remembered dreams. Could it be that they're tapping into possible futures? Versions of themselves scattered across time's branching paths? And this is what brings us back to the eyes of the Golden Throne. If these dreams, these flashes of the not yet real, are happening all over the Imperium, random, disconnected, then maybe the eyes aren't a physical organization at all. Maybe they're a phenomenon, a pattern, the collective experience of a billion psychers being exposed to temporal ripples in the warp. Some might be ignored. Others, those with the clarity or madness to interpret what they see, might be quietly marked, recruited, watched. Because if there is someone or something coordinating these visions, someone cataloging, analyzing, comparing psychic dreams across the galaxy, then the eyes of the Golden Throne might not be about seeing the present. They might be humanity's accidental attempt to understand the future, one fragmented dream at a time. For all the wild stories, haunting visions, and threads of fate woven through the lore of Warhammer 40K, there's always been a loud and necessary undercurrent of skepticism. And honestly, I think it makes the universe better. Because as compelling as the idea of prophecy and time sight might be, it's also deeply unreliable, messy, prone to interpretation, contradiction, and outright failure. And that's exactly what keeps it grounded in the grimdark setting. It's not a science, it's not a map of the stars, it's a gamble, and half the time it's probably a delusion. There's a good portion of the fan base that straight up rejects the idea that the Imperium can see through time in any meaningful way. They argue, pretty convincingly, that most so-called visions or prophecies are either byproducts of warp corruption or the fevered ramblings of psychers pushed too far. After all, how can you trust a vision received in a medium that's inherently chaotic and malicious? The warp doesn't just distort time, it lies, it mimics, it reflects what you want to see. And in a galaxy where belief shapes reality, how do you separate true foresight from dangerous wishful thinking? Some fans even bring up the idea that the warp might deliberately feed false visions to psychers. Imagine that. An entire campaign launched because of a dream seeded by a demon. A prophecy that leads an inquisitor to purge a loyal system. The warp doesn't need to break ships or spawn demons to win. It can just nudge one vision into the right mind. The Imperium, for all its might, is deeply paranoid and utterly dependent on signs. So what if most of these signs are traps? There's also the issue of retroactive clarity. So many of the so-called fulfilled prophecies in the lore are only recognized after the fact. Oh, the dream meant this war, or that vision was clearly about the fall of Cadia. But it's all backward-facing. No one ever seems to stop the disaster before it happens. They interpret visions only after the bodies are counted. And that raises the obvious question. What's the point of a prophecy if it doesn't prevent anything? If the Emperor's supposed agents can't act until hindsight makes it obvious, are they really seeing the future, or are they just trying to make sense of trauma? Then there's the perspective of the more grounded branches of the Imperium, like the Astra Militarum or the Administratum. These people live and die by cold numbers, not mystic visions. For them, the warp is a necessary evil, not a source of wisdom. And from that lens, prophecy isn't foresight. It's superstition, a waste of time. The Imperium is drowning in bureaucracy, starved for resources, and stretched across a dying galaxy. Who has time to listen to a dream when a hive world's population is rioting over food shortages? Even some inquisitors, especially those in the Ordo Hereticus, are notoriously wary of prophecy. Not because it's impossible, but because it's too easy to fake. Anyone with enough charisma and a few clever words can convince a desperate crowd that they've seen the future, that the Emperor spoke to them. And suddenly, you've got a cult, a rebellion, a crusade, all because someone had a nightmare and told the wrong people. So these inquisitors clamp down hard on unsanctioned visionaries, even if there's a sliver of truth in their claims. It's not about accuracy, it's about control. And then there's the storytelling angle. Within the community, some fans argue that prophecy is just a narrative crutch, a way to justify big twists or introduce mysterious elements without fully explaining them. It was foretold becomes a catch-all excuse. And yeah, sometimes it does feel lazy. If everything is fate, then what's the point of character agency? What's the point of sacrifice if the future is already written? But I don't think it's that simple. I think the contradiction is the point. The Imperium wants so badly to believe in fate, in meaning, in signs from a god who hasn't spoken in 10,000 years. And yet, deep down, even the most faithful know it's unreliable. That's what makes prophecy in Warhammer feel real, because it's murky, fallible, tainted by bias, emotion, and fear. The same dream that saves a planet might doom another. And no one ever knows which until it's too late. That tension between belief and doubt is part of what gives the setting its edge. It's not a universe of clean truths. It's a universe where everyone is grasping at shadows, trying to pull something certain from the void. And sometimes, yeah, they succeed. A vision turns out to be real. A dream becomes a warning. But more often than not, the signs are misread. The future comes anyway, uncaring and merciless. So when we talk about the eyes of the Golden Throne, whether they can see across time or not, we have to ask ourselves, even if they could, would it matter? Would anyone believe them? Or would they just be labeled mad, silenced, and forgotten like so many before them? In a way, that's the most 40K answer of all. Maybe the future is visible. Maybe someone has seen it. And maybe the Imperium, in its blindness, chose to ignore it. Because truth is dangerous. And in the end, it's easier to burn a prophet than to believe them. There's a theory, one of those haunting, half-mad ideas that keeps popping up in forums, codex footnotes, and long-forgotten lore fragments, that the Emperor of Mankind sees everything. Not in a metaphorical, poetic sense, but literally. That despite being entombed on the Golden Throne, sustained by the agony of 1,000 psychers a day, his consciousness has not faded into darkness. It has expanded, stretched across the warp like an all-seeing, all-feeling net. And yet, he says nothing. That's the part that breaks people. The silence. If the Emperor sees across time, past, present, and all the burning futures, why doesn't he act? Why does he allow so many tragedies to unfold? The heresy, the fall of Cadia, the rise of chaos cults in his own ecclesiarchy, all of it happening beneath the blindfold of his supposed omniscience. If he truly watches through the minds of the psychers, he's bound to his will. If he dreams through the nightmares of Astropaths, if he's the ghost behind every prophetic whisper, then why let it all rot? Some fans believe it's because he can't speak, that the Golden Throne, while preserving his body, has scattered his mind into a billion fragments, that he exists not as a person anymore, but as a thought stretched too thin, a psychic echo caught in an infinite loop. And maybe he does scream warnings through dreams, push thoughts into seers, guide visions like a ghost brushing its hand against your skin. But no one can truly hear him. Or worse, no one understands. Others take a more tragic view. They think the Emperor watches because he must, not because he wants to, that he's become the ultimate prisoner, bound to his own design, cursed with perfect vision but no agency, like a god nailed to a throne of silence. Some even describe him as the last lighthouse in a collapsing universe, its light still burning, but its keeper long since dead. The Astronomicon pulses not with direction, but with mourning. There's something deeply uncomfortable about that idea, that humanity's greatest protector has become something less than a god. Not an actor in the galaxy, but a camera, an archive, watching worlds burn in real time with no power to intervene. And every scream he hears, every betrayal he witnesses, simply adds to the endless psychic noise echoing through his soul. But then there's the darker version of the theory, the one that says he can act, that he chooses not to. This is the version that gets under my skin. That maybe the Emperor doesn't speak because he's done trying. That after 10,000 years of watching humanity betray him, fail him, and twist his vision into the very thing he fought against, he simply had enough. And in his silence, he passes judgment, not with words, not with wrath, but with abandonment, letting the Imperium stumble through the dark, waiting to see what's left standing at the end of time. Not out of cruelty, but out of cold, unfeeling logic. Some fans argue that this is his control, that silence is his weapon, that by withholding divine insight, he forces the Imperium to adapt, to evolve, that if he handed down guidance every time there was a crisis, humanity would never stand on its own. So he watches. He lets the fire burn. Because he knows that only in the crucible of failure will his species become what it was meant to be. It's a harsh, almost Darwinian vision of divinity. But this is Warhammer. Nothing here comes without a price. And yet, even if you accept that theory, the emotional weight is still there. Because if he really sees everything, if every child screaming in a hive city, every psyker ripped apart in a black ship, every guardsman dying on some forgotten battlefield is visible to him, then how can anyone love that kind of God? How can a being who witnesses the totality of suffering and says nothing still be called humanity's savior? It gets even messier when you consider the possibility that his mind is not one thing anymore, that after so many centuries of being fed warp essence, psyker pain, and belief, his consciousness has split. Some fragments might be merciful, others cold. Some might be actively working to shape events, whispering to saints and warlords alike. Others might be trying to undo what they once built. In this version, the Emperor isn't silent because he can't speak, but because there's no longer a single voice to do the speaking. And if that's true, then maybe the eyes of the Golden Throne aren't just watchers on his behalf. Maybe they're interpreters, trying to read the scattered fragments of his will across a galaxy-wide psychic storm, trying to understand what he wants, not because he's quiet, but because his message is broken, conflicted, mutating. It's this idea that the Emperor sees all but says nothing that captures the essence of 40K for me. The tragedy, the horror, the blind hope. A God who may be watching over you, or judging you, or simply watching you fall with indifference. And you'll never know which. Maybe that's the point. In this universe, certainty is a myth, and the Emperor's silence isn't a flaw. It's a test, or maybe a punishment. When you start looking at the concept of time and foresight in Warhammer 40K, you realize pretty quickly that the Imperium isn't alone in playing with the edges of causality. In fact, compared to some other races and entities in the setting, humanity's grip on the timeline looks clumsy, almost primitive. And that contrast is what makes the whole thing so fascinating, because it forces us to ask the question, if the Imperium can see through time, why does it do it so poorly? And what can we learn by comparing it to those who do it better? Let's start with the obvious one, Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate, the chaos god of time, change, and sorcery. If there's one entity in the entire galaxy that understands the shape of time and how to twist it, it's him. While the Imperium relies on flawed psychers, fractured prophecies, and desperate guesses, Tzeentch operates like a multi-dimensional chess master playing across 1,000 boards at once. He doesn't see the future in the same way mortals try to predict it. He weaves it. He manipulates probability, bending outcomes toward his will with such subtlety that most never realize they've become pieces in his game. And that's the terrifying part. Because if Tzeentch can shape the future, then anything the Imperium sees, any vision, any prophecy, could already be part of his design. Some fans argue that all Imperial foresight is, in a sense, contaminated. That the moment a psyker stares into the warp to glimpse what's coming, they're staring directly into Tzeentch's realm. Not a neutral stream of time, but a sea he controls. So how much of what the eyes of the Golden Throne see is real? And how much is exactly what he wants them to see? Then there are the Eldar, and oh boy, if you want a civilization obsessed with fate and prophecy, look no further. The Eldar don't just believe in the future, they study it. Their far-seers are trained specifically to walk the strands of fate, navigating through countless potential futures like a librarian flipping through a catalog. They don't just see what might happen, they choose which paths to walk. And yes, it's risky. Yes, the wrong step can doom an entire craft world. But when they get it right, it's like watching destiny snap into place. The contrast here is brutal. The Imperium, with all its bluster and firepower, mostly stumbles into the future. The Eldar sculpt it. And yet, both suffer, because even the Eldar, with all their psychic precision, are losing. Their ability to shape fate isn't enough to hold back entropy. And that, to me, is one of the most powerful parallels in the setting. Even those who can see the future clearly are still doomed by it. Which begs the question, maybe it's not about seeing the future, but accepting it. And maybe the eyes of the Golden Throne are less about control and more about bracing for impact. Let's talk about the Necrons. These guys don't mess around with prophecy or dreams. They deal with raw, calculated inevitability. Their cryptechs and chronomancers are some of the few beings in the galaxy who manipulate time like a tool. They don't just see into the future, they enter it, loop it, rewind it. There are documented cases of Necron weapons that undo a second of time, repositioning warriors or even reversing wounds. And some cryptechs claim to have escaped fate entirely, operating outside the bounds of cause and effect. Now, that's not prophecy in the traditional sense, but it's just as terrifying, because while the Imperium wonders what the future holds, the Necrons might already own it. It's like comparing someone reading a weather report to a god who can move the sun, and that disparity hits hard. Because if the Necrons ever fully regain their strength, the Imperium's stumbling visions and desperate prayers won't mean much against a force that can delete their futures like corrupted data. And then, surprisingly, we get a weird twist from the Tyranids. They're not sentient in the traditional sense, and they certainly don't use psychers to read the future. But the hive mind seems to react to the future as if it senses it coming. Entire tendrils avoid trap worlds before Imperial fleets even mobilize. Some believe the hive mind isn't seeing the future, but operating on such a vast psychic scale that it can feel probability shift. Like a sea creature feeling tremors before an earthquake. It's not prophecy. It's instinct on a galactic level, which raises the unsettling thought that maybe that's a more accurate form of foresight than anything the Imperium uses. Even the orcs, as ridiculous as it sounds, have their own bizarre relationship with fate. Their collective "wah" field bends reality to their beliefs. If enough orcs believe something will happen, it often does. It's not conscious prophecy, but it's still a kind of predictive power, just chaos wearing a grinning face. The future isn't seen or understood. It's shouted into existence. So what does this tell us about the Imperium? Honestly, it paints a picture of a species struggling with tools it barely understands, while surrounded by beings who've either mastered those tools or become slaves to them. The Imperium's attempts to spy across time feel like someone trying to fix a broken machine with a hammer and hope. There's desperation, there's reverence, but there's very little precision. And yet, there's something uniquely human in that. Because unlike the Necrons, humanity doesn't seek to own time. Unlike the Eldar, it doesn't pretend to fully understand it. And unlike Tzeentch, it doesn't twist it for amusement. It stares into the future, scared and overwhelmed, and still moves forward. Still tries. And maybe that's what the eyes of the Golden Throne are about. Not mastery, but resistance. Watching the tide come in and saying, "Not yet." The future in Warhammer is a battlefield like any other, and the Imperium, broken, blind, bleeding, is still standing on it, watching, waiting, and maybe, just maybe, understanding more than we think. So what do we do with all of this? We've gone through ancient choirs of Astropaths and secretive inquisitorial cabals. We've followed warp-ridden dreams, fractured timelines, failed prophecies, and fleeting moments of clarity in a galaxy drowning in chaos. And at the center of it all, the Emperor. Silent. Watching. Or maybe not. Maybe just remembered as watching. The question we started with was deceptively simple. Do the eyes of the Golden Throne spy across time itself? And after everything, the answer feels like both yes and no, or rather yes, but not how we hoped. It's easy to imagine the eyes as a unified organization, cloaked agents huddled around chronometric cogitators, whispering fragments of fate into vox lines. But the truth is probably much messier. The eyes aren't a group. They're a phenomenon. They're a pattern. The dreams of psychers, the obsessions of navigators, the cold predictions of inquisitors, the frantic notes left by madmen who saw too much. They're all part of it. Pieces of something the Imperium doesn't even realize it has. They're not really spying across time. They're drowning in it. And what about the Emperor? That's the part that breaks me. If these scattered visions are his will, if the eyes are a function of his divine foresight, then what kind of god does that make him? One that speaks in riddles no one understands? One that lets his servants burn in wars they foresaw and couldn't stop? Or is he not guiding these visions at all? Maybe he's just the psychic sun they orbit, bright enough to cast shadows, but too far to warm them. There's a tragic beauty to that. A dying god surrounded by voices that echo futures he can't reach. The galaxy itself has become a kaleidoscope of what might be, and the Imperium just keeps staring, desperate for a pattern it can act on. But the future won't stand still, and the more they look, the more uncertain it becomes. I've heard fans say that the Emperor's greatest failure wasn't the Horus heresy or the betrayal of his sons. It was time, that he never found a way to escape it, predict it, or control it. And now, all he can do is watch his empire rot in slow motion while his loyal eyes try to make sense of what little signal they can find in the noise. But maybe it's not about control. Maybe these visions, these dreams, these half-seen timelines, they're not meant to be commands. They're warnings, questions, tests, not of loyalty, but of understanding. Can humanity survive if it knows how fragile everything really is? Can we act with conviction even when we're not sure the signs are real? Because let's be honest, if you saw the future of the galaxy, really saw it, would you still fight for it? I think that's the core of the question. Not whether the eyes can spy across time, but what they do with what they see. Do they act? Do they warn? Do they scream into the void and hope someone listens? Or do they go mad from knowing how little power they actually have? And if you're like me, obsessed with these little threads of lore, these overlooked fragments that hint at something bigger, you probably see yourself in that. We're all, in some weird way, trying to see across time. Digging through old books, hunting for clues, putting together lore from scattered sources, looking for meaning in a universe built on absurdity and pain. So maybe we are the eyes of the Golden Throne. Just fans with too much caffeine and not enough sleep, squinting into the darkness, wondering what comes next, wondering if our theories are glimpses of something real or just beautifully constructed madness. Either way, I want to hear what you think. Do you believe the Emperor sees through time? Are there really servants who spy across centuries and whisper what they find into the right ears? Or is it all just a coping mechanism? An empire pretending to see the future because it's too afraid to admit it's flying blind? Let me know your theories, your doubts, your wildest ideas in the comments below. I read them all, and trust me, I'm just as obsessed as you are. And if you enjoyed this journey through the cracked lens of time, give it a like, share it with a fellow heretic, and hit that subscribe button. There's always another shadow to chase in this galaxy, and I'll be right here chasing it with you. Until next time, keep watching the stars. They might just be watching back.